If you buy Ben & Jerry's, are you essentially paying for your own marketing? Every company has a budget for different things. Why? Because the company only makes a certain amount of money, a certain amount of revenue. And this revenue then needs to be somehow created. And of course, from the revenue, a certain split goes into product development, goes into marketing, goes into paying the wages, goes into paying potentially trademark fees, and so on and so on and so on. So, of course, a company like Ben & Jerry's also needs to create the product. But I would argue that paying €6, for example, for a bucket of ice is probably completely overpriced. The production cost is probably much lower. Maybe 20%, maybe 30%, maybe it's 10%. What you essentially are paying for with your margin or with the higher price is a higher margin. And this higher margin means that for every given Ben & Jerry's they sell, they make more revenue. But because the margin is higher, this means that the cost for producing a given Ben & Jerry's, the actual production cost for the thing you buy, is lower or much lower compared to the cost at which you buy it, which is called the price. So now the difference is the margin. And from the margin, of course, the other costs have to be covered. So the production cost obviously is covered by the part that is this part, by this part of the price that is actually identical to the production cost. But the rest goes to the rest of the company. Now, often there are people who argue that if the production cost of an item is only this much, then the product should also cost this much. But this reaches not long enough. I don't know what the correct phrase here is, but it doesn't paint the whole picture, to find another metaphor I could actually use. Now, why does it not paint the whole picture? Because the production cost is just the production cost. The reason you are buying Ben & Jerry's and not the alternative ice cream, probably is not something that is very healthy, but the reason you are buying Ben & Jerry's and not the alternative is probably you already know Ben & Jerry's. You also might have a potential historic event stored in your brain that is a good experience with Ben & Jerry's. You also might think that Ben & Jerry's is actually better because it is higher priced, which is usually called something along the lines of the high price cost fallacy or something like this. Basically, given the fact that often in the past, historically, something that had lower production cost was lower in value compared to the same item with higher production cost, of course not the same item, but an item of the same category, it was a reasonable simplification or decision rule to assume that higher priced items actually had higher value. Now, in today's age and time, things changed. And because we are not very rational actors actually, even though economics to a large degree actually assumes we are rational actors, only buying things that are very useful, we have to now take other variables into account if we still want to encompass everything under the umbrella of utility, which is the ultimate term for how useful something is. So basically, if you think of minimalism, of how functional something is, or not how minimal, but how functional something is, how much value it provides, you could also say. But it is not called valutility, but it is called utility. That's the one common thread that is the utility, the value something provides. So now, if you take a look at Ben & Jerry's, the question is how much of this utility goes towards covering your basic needs of food, and how much of this utility goes towards satisfying your instantaneous or very current, very short-term needs for cravings or for satisfying these cravings, and how much of this goes into, for some reason, satisfying a part of your brain that thinks Ben & Jerry's is a good ice cream. And the question we have to ask ourselves is the question why this part of our brain exists that wants to satisfy these ice cream cravings with Ben & Jerry's, and not with not with an alternative that is way cheaper and that is actually often the native brands or the original brands of grocery stores. Of course, to some degree, Ben & Jerry's might have figured out a secret formula, But if we take Coca-Cola and Pepsi, for example, then people often don't even know the difference in taste. The same is true for many people who taste wine. Many cannot even tell the difference between a bottle that is 10 times the cost of the other bottle, that is the cheap bottle. So therefore, the value that the Ben & Jerry's provides is mostly just a psychological value. It satisfies psychological needs. Of course, Ben & Jerry's in total only satisfies psychological needs, you could say, even though some of these psychological needs are actually based in something physical, the craving for sugar and fat, also based in evolution. Due to the high caloric density of this food, it seemed to be evolutionary reasonable, at least to my current understanding of this topic, to crave these foods if they are available. There is also a theory I developed, at least for myself, is the recency theory. This means if you have a given food that is considerably crappy, then of course you might crave this food more because it is so crappy and because of the things that make you crave this crappy thing. But now, if you are hungry, that what I have noticed, at least with myself, is that I seem to only recall the foods I recently ate. If I'm really hungry, fasting for 2 days, I'm speaking about this kind of hungry, then what I usually remember is not the food I ate 15 years ago, but the food I ate maybe 2 weeks ago. Now, what I think is there might be some evolutionary algorithm that is based on the assumption that if things have been eaten very recently, that similar things might be around. So if there was a bush with berries, for example, then the chances of you then remembering these berries 2 weeks later when you are very hungry, and then remembering to go back to this location where these berries were, might be a good hint for where to get food, and not the thing you saw 15 years ago, or the Ben & Jerry's you ate 15 years ago and then decided to quit once and for all because you're basically paying for your own marketing. Now, why are you paying for your own marketing? If you buy a reasonably priced alternative, what you are essentially buying for is also some kind of marketing. But now, how many times have you seen a Ben & Jerry's ad? I have probably in between 25 to 250 times in my life, I guess. Anywhere in this range. And they are still advertising and advertising and advertising. Every time I open up YouTube, whenever I'm not subscribed to Premium and whenever I am accessing YouTube with no ad blocker, it's not every time, but I have seen a reasonable amount of Ben & Jerry's ads. And it's basically the only ice cream that sprung to my mind when I thought about this topic. It's Ben & Jerry's. What else would there be? It is not the cheap alternative from your local grocery store, because it is not engraved in your brain. So, so the company Ben & Jerry's, of course, now could be super profitable with this high margin. But given we compare this to another ice cream company, I think the assumption that this company is super successful, not super successful, but has a very high margin and therefore pays out lots of dividends, I don't know if they pay out dividends, is an assumption that is probably not very true. Because if this was the case, and if Ben & Jerry's had really figured out something that would work, then compared to all the other companies out there, it would create much more revenue, and not only revenue, but much more profit. And if Ben & Jerry's created so much profit, then basically everybody would want to invest in Ben & Jerry's. Therefore, the market equilibrium of people investing not only in Ben & Jerry's, but also into different companies would be skewed towards everybody investing in Ben & Jerry's, and Ben & Jerry's growing into the biggest ice cream company the whole world has ever seen. But obviously this has not been the case, at least as of my understanding, or as of my knowledge, I should rather say. So therefore, Ben & Jerry's are probably spending a lot of their revenue on something else. And this something else, I think, probably has to be, at least to some extent, much more marketing than the local grocery store alternative. So therefore, what you are effectively doing, if you are paying €6 for the Ben & Jerry's, you could probably also have for €2 if you just decided to search for something comparable at another or the same grocery store. Then what you are effectively doing is you are not paying for higher wages at Ben & Jerry's, potentially, but potentially also only maybe 10% more. But compared to an alternative that is maybe also similar in taste, what you are essentially paying for, the premium you are paying for, is the marketing. And now if you think about whether this company has actually a budget for marketing, then the current customer base obviously pays for the current marketing. Given the fact that Ben & Jerry's doesn't have shares in a lot of other companies and actually invests money wisely, apart from its current business, we just assume that it creates the marketing budget from, not the budget itself, because the budget is just a constraint, but creates the money that is spent on marketing with the current sales they are having. Therefore, as the final resolution, if you now are paying for Ben & Jerry's compared to not buying an alternative that is reasonably priced, what you are effectively doing is you're probably just paying for your own marketing. You are paying Ben & Jerry's to bombard you with ads, and then you are buying a Ben & Jerry's, and you effectively just reinforced the circle once again.